Hey guys, so in this quick little Houdini Redshift tutorial, I wanted to cover material overrides. And so recently, if you guys are using the 3.0 builds, there was a new feature to actually allow you to use material overrides for packed primitives or instances. And so the native Houdini material overrides in the past only worked when it was unique geometry. So this is a pretty neat feature I was hoping to share with you guys. One of the cool things about this feature is it lets you use strings to actually override textures and stuff, and that's been requested by a lot of people, but unfortunately Redshift does not support string user data nodes yet. So this is a way actually around that limitation with Houdini. So we've got just a little basic setup here, just some boxes, and they're just copied onto our grid. I'm going to pack and instance these, so they're considered now packed primitives. On the top level, to make sure they instance correctly, you need to go under your Redshift OBJ, go under instancing, and check on instance top level packed primitives. So these will now be treated like packed prims. So if we wanted to assign a material, let's just make a material here. And we're just going to have this assigned to everything, so the group as a whole. And actually, let's make a material. So I'm going to just make my generic, Redshift material I always use to start with. And I'm going to just bring that up. Let's go here. So this should be applied. So if I render this now with the IPR, and actually I need to switch this since it's going to be working on the points to a point attribute up here. And so if I reload this and we check out our IPR, so this is what we've got. We've got our shader, our gray shader here applied. And if I jump over, we can just come in here and adjust the color to whatever. Right, and so it's updating live. So one of the neat things is that we could actually use overrides in SOPs in order to override the properties. So let's say I wanted to override, I don't know, everything that's in our scene. We could click one of these local overrides. Let's hit reload here. And inside of here, you could choose a different type of parameters. These are what are exposed. Now, the way this works is we need to actually load in and create a parameter that we could use. And this is going to be a color value. And so this is going to be the color that gets overridden. But now we need to tell it which parameter we actually plan on overriding. So to do that, you need to come inside of your material, and you need to actually promote your properties to be on the top level of your builder. So if we come in here, and let's just, for example, open this up, and we've got, see our diffuse color here, and you middle mouse click it, you can choose to promote the parameter. You'll get this little green tag here. And what that means is that, and it'll be grayed out, it means that it is now promoted at the top level of our builder. So you can see it's here, diffuse color. You can also promote a parameter by just actually clicking on these little cogwheels on the side of the parameter and choosing promote parameter. So now that that's exposed here, the diffuse underscore color, if we go up to our object again, and we come in here, and you'll see if we choose a parameter on the list, we'll have diffuse color, or you can manually just type it in, you know, if you were to just go diffuse color, whatever, right? And it'll show up that way, or you could just select it this way. This is a little more convenient when it's only a couple, but once your list gets pretty big, you might be better off just remembering the name. So now that we've got it in here, the type is the type of data. So because we're overriding a color, we're going to use color value. But if it was a string, a float, or an integer, you would use different options. For this particular parameter, it's obviously a color. It's 3 floats. So we're going to use color. And we're going to just switch this over to like a teal color. And let's refresh the IPR. And bring that over here. And you'll see now that it overrode our original color that we had selected, which was originally a gray color. Here, see? So that's really cool. So if we actually go back to OBJ, if we were to disable this or remove it, it would no longer be gray. And we can change the color to whatever we want. Obviously, it works on anything. Switch to blue. For some reason, I think when it's a packed prim, you kind of got to manually reload. And I believe that could be fixed inside of our IPR section in the rendering ROP. There's options in here. For instance, IPR live SOP level updates, deformation, volumes, instancers, proxies. Some of these options are left off by default, like style sheets, cops. So this might fix it. Let's find out. So turning that on. Let's just reload just in case. And let's see if that worked. And nope, it didn't. So unfortunately, you're going to have to manually, for now at least, I'll mention this as in a bug report, but you got to manually do this when working with packed primitives. You actually can override even if they're not packed primitives, so you can uncheck packet instance. Let's come up here, uncheck that, and if we hit play, we now need to switch this from point attributes to primitive, and you'll see that it also works when it's just standard objects. So it looks like when it's standard objects, it updates in the IPR live, but when they're packed primitives, you actually have to manually update. So yeah, pretty cool. Now, one of the neat things about this is that you're actually able to specify specific groups that should get the changes. So this opens up doors with lots of possibilities. I know that some people get confused with style sheets, so this method is a little bit better. And it also doesn't make your shader graph complicated since you're not using shader switches or user data. So if let's just pause this for a second. Let's just make a duplicate, plug that in. And we're going to override again the diffuse color, but let's choose a green. And this time, instead of overriding all our objects, we're going to actually choose, let's say, 1 through 5. So that's going to pick our points 1 through 5 and override them with that green. So if I press play, and actually not points because these are primitives. So let me switch that over again to point. Switch over back to pack an instance. Pack an instance. And there we go. So we've got the each one now is a point attribute, and this is referring to points 1 through 5. So 0 would be this point. And so you could use standard groups. So if you had object groups already selected, if you made groups for some reason, for example, let's just come up here, move this down. Let's just make a group. And I'm just going to randomly pick a couple groups here. Let's pause this. So we'll just pick this, these. We'll just hit enter. And this will work obviously with any kind of group SOP. I'm just going to randomly do that. And instead we select, here, let's delete these. And actually for our group, we need to make sure this is points. since they're being packed already. And here you go. You see we have group 1. And if we come up here and press play, we'll get all of our currently packed primitive groups and their color parameter that we promoted earlier is being overridden. So this makes it really convenient and easy to layer up overrides on packed primitives. And we could do lots of stuff with this. So let's go up to material, and let's just drop down a texture instead, and we're going to plug that in, and that got rid of our promoted color. But you could promote any of these parameters like I mentioned earlier, the reflection, stuff like that. And here we're going to just load up a texture, so hip text, and actually, here we go. Let's just pick texture 1. And so if we render this real quick, we should just get the same number. And, oh, and that's because I have the override still active. So let me jump back up here to material. Oops, no. Object. And let's just get rid of the override for both of these. And actually I need to make a texture, or not a texture, a UV. So UV project, and we'll just initialize. And I thought I deleted this, but let's clear that out also. And let's move this material up to here. And actually this needs to be a primitive attribute. And so if we fire up the IPR, this is what we get. So we've got our material, and each primitive, it's getting that our first texture here. And what we can do is actually override the textures per point. And so you could use strings to actually do this, little string expressions, which is pretty neat. Or you could, build an attribute per point and read that in. So there's several ways we could do this. But first, to actually get that to work, so we've got our override here. Let's pause this for a second. Move that out of the way, or we'll just leave it. And the method that you would use is, again, we're going to just use the group that we made earlier. So it's those points, but we could actually write something in there separately. And so we're going to override, and this time we need to override the texture input. But one of the problems is that there is no little cogwheel or a simple way to just promote it. And so we're going to use a string value, since it's a texture that we're going to actually override. And we need to make it so that we could provide the parameter name here. So if we go back to our material and we dive in, there is no way you could just directly promote this just like this. So the easiest way is to just come up to the top level and make a string input here. So we'll go to edit parameter interface when you hit the little cogwheel, and let's scoot this over, and you'll see that we've got our parameters here currently exposed, and we're going to just add a new parameter. So we're going to come over to this left side, and you'll see that we have string. And so you could give this a name, whatever you want. We'll just call this text 0, text 0, just short for texture. And we'll hit apply. And you'll see that we've got this empty string section. And so if we come up to back to our object and we go to choose parameter, you'll notice that we now have text 0. And so that's going to be what we're overriding. And now the trick here is that we need to just make this feed into our texture input. So if I hit right click and go to copy parameter, and we come into here and I paste a relative reference, what it's going to do is it's going to read whatever we input here and pipe it in. Now, instead of just a plain string, you could also use, if we go back into our edit parameters, you could switch this to the file image. And so if we just hit apply, we'll get a similar kind of file loading screen here. And so if I just load up what we had earlier, so hit this, we come into text, and we've got our little textures here. So I'm going to just pick texture 1. This is what we're getting. And so if I come over here, it's referencing that texture. And so right now, if I were to render this, and actually let's go back to our object. This should be working. If I don't override anything. So let's just highlight this, and I just refresh the IPR, and yeah, so right now it's back to reading our texture here like we had originally. But now what we could do is we can override these textures using a string value, which is really neat. So let's, for example, let's get rid of our group. Let's make it all of them, and we wanted to randomize which points have which textures. So we have currently 3 textures. So there's several ways we could approach this. One way is using expressions, or we could actually just make attributes on the points. So I'll show you guys the attribute method. So let's just do a randomized attribute for now. And we're going to just call this, I don't know, text. And we only need 1 dimension. And we need 0 through 2. So 0, 1, 2 are the numbers that are going to be generated. Actually, no, since my naming for my textures, it starts at 1. So we need 1 through 3. So what this is going to do, let's just save real quick. If we go over to the geometry spreadsheet, you'll notice that we've now got this new attribute called text, and it's going randomly between 1 and 3. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this will work, if it'll just round off the numbers, but to be more sure, you need to use something like an attribute cast, and this will convert our float values that we have here. So the 2.33, it'll get rid of all this and round it off to a full integer, and that's what we need. So we're going to call this text, which is the name of the attribute, and we're going to switch this to just 8-bit unassigned integer, and so this is going to give us the full rounded number, 2, 1, 3, and so on. So now we've got the attribute here. If we scoot this over, you'll notice that we've got text, and so what we could do is override our texture. And so we know that our texture, if we load it up here, This is the name. So we've got this name here. And you can see on our override, it's giving us the full path to the texture, and it's picking text 1. So what we could do instead of this number 1 is use the backtick, the @ symbol, because we're pulling up an attribute, type in text, which is the name of the attribute we made earlier, and then we'll drop another backtick and press enter. And what you'll notice is that it did not change any of our numbers here yet, and the reason is because you need to activate the override using use local variables. So these are the local variables that we created here, this attribute, the text attribute. So as soon as you activate this, you'll now notice that it's picking 2, 1, 3, 2, and it's choosing from our attribute that we created up here with the randomize. So this is one way we could do things. And now if I come over here and we'll just hit the IPR, let me save the scene. You'll notice that now it's randomly per point changing our texture input based on this attribute we created. So this is really cool, really easy way to randomize the texture inputs. And so as you can imagine, you could easily randomize hundreds of textures just using an attribute randomize method. Or let's duplicate this to the side. We'll plug it in here. And instead of using an attribute that we created, we're going to actually use an expression. So let's come up here and delete what we had. Let's make this a little bigger. And so what we want to do is make an expression here where it's going to randomly generate what we need. And actually I'm going to open up Notepad++ so you guys can see what I'm typing, since it could be a little difficult to see since it's small. So I'm going to just paste it here. And you'll see that right now we're just pointing to the direction, and we have 3 texture files that are 1 through the number 3. So after this underscore, we need to tell Houdini how to randomize this. So the backtick, this means that we're going to put down an expression or an attribute, and we want integers. So we're going to type in int, and we're going to open up a bracket, and we're going to type in rand, which is for random. So it's going to give us a random number. And the way that we're getting this random number, so let's open up another parentheses here, and we're going to get this from the intrinsic point value. So $PT is an intrinsic point number value that each point gets. So we're going to close that. And so this is now telling us that we want a random point number, and it has to be an integer that we're returning. And so if I were to actually just plug this in right now, let's just copy, paste it in. It's not going to work. We're going to get an error. And the reason is I still have to specify the range of numbers, and I also need to add a backtick at the end. I forgot to do that. So it still won't work. So a backtick to close everything. And we still need actually another parentheses too. So if I do this, you'll see that we're only getting zeros. And the reason is because I need to specify the range of numbers I want. So to do that, we're going to just multiply by 3. Oops. And so that's going to give us 3, because we have 3 textures, or the range of numbers we want. So if I do this now and hit enter, you'll see that we're getting 3 numbers, but we're not getting the 3. We're getting a 0. And that's because it's going to start from 0 and then do 0, 1, 2. And that's 3 numbers. So what we need to do now is we need to add a 1. Oops. And so when we do this, we're telling it to start at 1. And our value range is 3 numbers. And we want a random number between those for each point, and it needs to be an integer, not a float. So if we paste this in now, you'll notice that we're getting 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, and it's the same. It's basically the same result as this. In fact, if I switch between the two, we are getting a little difference, but it's pretty much the same randomness. So if I hit render now and hit play, you'll see that we're also getting those random numbers. And obviously you can limit this randomness if you want using the group. Let's reload. And you'll see that most of them are A's now. But the areas that we had grouped have A's, B's, and C's. So if I switch over here, you'll see how the material override is only occurring in areas that were part of my group. And you can see group 1 here. Zeros have no override, and so on. So this lets you control it with groups, and you can control what points further get it using attributes or expressions. So this is really, really cool and really powerful. This has been, if you guys use mantras, you already know this has been here forever. But it's pretty neat that Redshift now supports this even in packed primitives. So before it didn't work with packed primitives or instances, and now you can actually use these override methods to do that. And so yeah, obviously on top of this, we could further add overrides and change roughness or other parameters, and this lets you easily add a lot of variation at the SOP level without even touching user data on your shader graph at all. So really cool, really powerful. And yeah, so that hopefully you guys kind of understand it. I'm gonna include the file in a link below, so in case you guys kind of got lost or it was confusing, you can open it up yourselves and check out the two different methods, and I'll label both of these so you can just see the different ways you could go about it. So we'll just do, this is the attribute randomize method, and we'll just call this the expression randomize. And yeah, so hopefully you guys can see how this was useful for your own setups to randomize textures, colors, any parameter that you can get your hands on in Redshift for your shaders. You can override them using this method. So yeah, thanks again guys for all the support here on YouTube and on Patreon. I appreciate it. Have a great day.